They say silence is golden, but sometimes silence isn't an absence of words. It's the gathering of a storm. It's the quiet, meticulous work of justice sharpening its blade before it strikes. For Eleanor Vance, a woman of 62 whose life had been a testament to grace and quiet strength, this particular silence began on a Tuesday afternoon under the soft, golden light of the Oakwood Country Club terrace. This was her sanctuary, a place she and her late husband, Richard, had helped build from the ground up, a place filled with the ghosts of happy memories. She was stirring her iced tea, the clinking of the spoon against the glass, the only sound in her peaceful bubble, until two voices, familiar as her own reflection, drifted over from a nearby table. She recognized them instantly, Carol and Patricia, women she had shared decades of laughter and charity fundraisers with. But the words they spoke were alien, grotesque. They were whispers, laced with a venomous pity that was worse than outright hatred. They were talking about her. They said she was losing her grip, that her memory was failing her. They recounted a story, a cruel and twisted fiction, about how she had berated Richard in his final, painful days. They murmured with feigned concern about the Vance family fortune, suggesting it was being squandered on frivolous whims. And then came the final, devastating blow, the source of this poison. "Amelia is just so worried," Carol whispered. "She says Eleanor is not the woman she once was. The poor girl is trying her best to hold everything together." Amelia, her son's wife, her daughter-in-law. The initial shock was a physical blow, a theft of breath that left her momentarily paralyzed. But what followed was not the hot rush of tears or the crumbling despair of a victim. Instead, a profound and terrifying coldness settled deep within her bones. In that instant, listening to the architecture of her life being dismantled by lies, the gentle, grieving widow ceased to exist. The benevolent matriarch vanished. She was replaced by something new, something forged in the heart of betrayal, a strategist. A silent observer who now saw the chessboard with perfect, chilling clarity. She did not weep. She did not confront them. She simply placed her spoon carefully on the saucer, took a final, steadying sip of her tea, and signed the bill. As she walked past their table, she offered Carol and Patricia a small, serene nod, a gesture so normal it was utterly unnerving. They smiled back, oblivious. But as Eleanor Vance stepped out into the bright afternoon sun, the storm inside her finally had a name. It was called the truth, and she would make sure every last person would hear its thunder. To understand the storm that was gathering, you must first understand the world of calm it was born from, the world of Eleanor Vance. Her life was a carefully curated masterpiece of quiet elegance and unshakable dignity, built over 40 years alongside her husband, Richard. She hadn't been born into this world of manicured lawns and old money that defined the Connecticut shoreline. She had earned her place in it, not with ambition, but with character. She came from a family of teachers, people who valued books over bank statements, and she carried that thoughtful stillness with her always. When she met Richard, he was a force of nature, a young builder with calloused hands, and a blueprint for a future that only he could see. He was the dreamer, the one who saw sprawling communities where others saw empty fields. But Eleanor, she was the architect of their life. She was the one who saw the people who would live in those homes, the families who would grow there. While he built an empire of brick and mortar, she built a foundation of reputation, of trust, of community. Their company, Vance Properties, became a regional powerhouse, not through hostile takeovers or ruthless deals, but through a commitment to quality and integrity, a reflection of their partnership. He was the bold signature. She was the steady hand that guided the pen. Their home was not some cold, ostentatious mansion designed to intimidate. It was a living museum of their love story. A sprawling, stone-faced Georgian manor nestled amongst ancient oak trees. Every room held an echo of their shared journey. The grand library, with its floor-to-ceiling shelves, held not only first editions, but also Richard's worn-out business manuals and her collection of poetry, their minds and souls resting side by side. The scuffs on the hardwood floors in the great hall were from their son, Michael's frantic tricycle races. The faint scent of lavender and old paper that permeated the air was the very scent of Eleanor's presence, a calming constant in a changing world. After Richard's passing 2 years ago, the house had grown quieter, the silence filled only by the weight of his absence. But Eleanor did not shrink from it. She saw herself not as a widow in an empty house, but as a custodian of a legacy. Richard had known his time was limited, and in his final months, they had planned for the future with the same meticulous care they had planned their business. He had placed the entirety of their estate into the Vance Family Trust, a fortress of legal protection with one clear commander, Eleanor. She was the sole trustee, the executor, the guardian of everything they had built, until the day she died. It was not a gesture of control, but one of absolute faith. He knew that only she understood the soul of their enterprise, that for her, the money was never the point, it was the means to continue the good work they had started together. Her relationship with their son, Michael, was the central pillar of her existence. He was a good man, she had made sure of it. He had his father's intelligence, but her softer, more contemplative nature. He was a successful architect in his own right, though he preferred designing art museums to corporate headquarters. She saw her husband's fire tempered in him, and it made her proud. Their bond was one of deep, unspoken understanding. They had weathered the storm of Richard's illness together, her quiet strength a beacon for his grief. After his father was gone, Michael would visit every Sunday for dinner, a ritual that became a lifeline for them both. They would talk for hours in the den, surrounded by photographs chronicling a happy life, a life that seemed impervious to the ugliness of the world outside. She saw him as the eventual heir to the legacy, not just the fortune. She was simply its protector, preparing it for the day he was ready to lead. She never saw the subtle weakness that lay dormant within him, the deep-seated desire to please others, a trait that, in the hands of a manipulator, could be twisted from a virtue into a devastating weapon. In the community, Eleanor Vance was more than just a wealthy widow. She was an institution. She didn't just write checks to charities. She sat on their boards. She organized their galas. She knew the names of the families who lived in the shelter she had funded. The Vance name wasn't just on a plaque on a hospital wing. It was in the hearts of the people they had helped. Her generosity was not for show. It was a deeply ingrained part of who she was, a belief instilled by her parents that a fortunate life came with a profound responsibility to others. This was the reputation that Amelia was now systematically dismantling, brick by painful brick. She was taking Eleanor's greatest strength, her quiet dignity, and reframing it as aloofness. She was taking her careful stewardship of the family trust and painting it as the erratic behavior of a mind in decline. She was taking a life built on integrity and smearing it with the vilest of lies. As Eleanor stood in her silent home, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the polished floors, the echo of the whispers from the country club reverberated in the stillness. She looked at the portrait of Richard above the mantelpiece, his eyes so full of life and love, and she understood. This was not just an attack on her. It was an attack on him, on their life, on the very truth of their love. The world of calm was an illusion. It had always been a battlefield in disguise, and she, its quiet queen, would now have to become its general. The fight would not be loud or theatrical. It would be fought in the shadows, with whispers and secrets of her own. It would be a war of attrition, and Eleanor Vance had a lifetime of patience and a will of iron. Amelia arrived not like a gentle breeze, but like a sudden, dazzling summer storm after a long and mournful winter. Michael brought her to the Vance home for Sunday dinner about a year after Richard's death, and her presence instantly filled the quiet rooms with a vibrant energy they hadn't felt in ages. She was beautiful, of course, in a modern, sharp-edged way that was the antithesis of Eleanor's classic grace. She had bright, intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing, and a laugh that was loud and infectious. From the moment she walked through the door, she was performing, and it was a masterful performance. She gushed over the house, not with the hollow flattery of a stranger, but with what appeared to be a genuine appreciation for its history. She touched the spines of the books in the library, asking Michael which ones were his father's favorites. She looked at the family portraits with a soft, reverent expression, telling Eleanor, "You and Richard were such a handsome couple. I feel like I can see the love right here in this photograph." She brought a bouquet of freesias, Eleanor's favorite flower, a small but significant detail Michael had undoubtedly shared, which Amelia wielded with surgical precision. For the first time in a long time, Eleanor saw her son truly, incandescently happy. The lingering shadow of grief that had clung to him seemed to evaporate in Amelia's bright presence. He looked at her with a kind of desperate adoration, and for that, Eleanor was prepared to love her. A mother's greatest wish is to see her child happy, and Michael was glowing. So Eleanor welcomed her, opened her home and her heart, believing this vibrant young woman was the answer to a prayer she had barely dared to whisper. Amelia, for her part, played the role of the devoted future daughter-in-law to perfection. She insisted on helping in the kitchen. She remembered the name of their long-serving housekeeper, Maria, and she listened with rapt attention as Eleanor shared stories about the early days of Vance Properties. She was a mirror, reflecting back the best parts of the family, making them feel seen and admired. Yet, even in those early days, Eleanor's finely tuned intuition, the same instinct that had helped her vet Richard's business partners for 40 years, picked up on faint, discordant notes. They were tiny, almost imperceptible moments that were easy to dismiss, but they lingered in her mind long after Amelia's cheerful goodbyes. The first time it happened, they were in Eleanor's dressing room. Amelia had admired a sapphire necklace Eleanor was wearing, a piece Richard had given her for their 30th anniversary. Eleanor, pleased by the compliment, had opened her jewelry box to show her the matching earrings. As Amelia looked at the collection of jewels pieces that were, for Eleanor, tangible memories of birthdays, anniversaries, and shared triumphs, her bright, admiring gaze shifted. For a split second, her eyes took on a different quality, a cool, appraising glint. It was not the look of a young woman admiring beautiful things, it was the look of an auctioneer assessing inventory. The smile never left her face, but the warmth did not reach her eyes. The moment passed as quickly as it came, and Amelia was back to gushing, but Eleanor felt a faint, inexplicable chill. Then came the questions about the family's finances. They were always cleverly disguised, wrapped in layers of compliments and feigned curiosity. Richard was such a genius to structure the trust this way, she would say, her head tilted thoughtfully. It must be so complex. I'm fascinated by business, and I'd love to understand how he protected his legacy so brilliantly. At first, Eleanor answered vaguely, treating the questions as a sign of intellectual curiosity, but they became more specific, more pointed. So, the trust provides for Michael, but does it have provisions for his future family? Is the principal untouchable? They were questions a lawyer might ask, not a loving girlfriend. Each one felt like a small, probing intrusion into a sacred space, an attempt to map out the contours of a fortune she had no claim to. Perhaps the most unsettling was Amelia's subtle campaign to isolate Michael. It was done with the delicate touch of a master strategist. She would find reasons to cancel long-standing plans with his oldest friends, always framing it as an act of devotion to him. "Darling, you've worked so hard this week," she'd murmur. "Do you really want to go out with Mark and his noisy friends? Let's just stay in. I'll cook your favorite meal." She created an exclusive world for the two of them, a world where her voice was the only one he heard, her opinions the only ones that mattered. She made Michael feel as though his previous life was somehow lacking, and that only she could provide the perfect, tailor-made happiness he deserved. Old friends were slowly relegated to the periphery, their calls less frequently returned, until their presence in his life was a mere echo. Eleanor watched this slow, systematic pruning of her son's social circle with a growing sense of dread. But what could she say? How could a mother voice these suspicions without sounding like the very cliché she despised, the jealous, possessive matriarch, unwilling to let her son go? She second-guessed her own judgment, chiding herself for being uncharitable. She had lived a life of quiet privilege and knew little of the struggles of a young woman trying to find her place in a powerful family. Perhaps Amelia's forwardness was just a sign of modern confidence. Perhaps her interest in their finances was a practical desire to understand the life she was entering. Eleanor told herself she was being unfair, that she was still grieving Richard and viewing the world through a lens of suspicion. She did try to broach the subject with Michael once, just once. They were in the garden, pruning Richard's prized roses. "Amelia seems to have made you very happy," "Dear," she began gently. "She's everything," Michael replied, his face illuminated with a love that was almost painful to watch. Eleanor chose her words carefully. "It's just, she asks a lot of questions about the trust, about financial matters. It's a little unusual." The light in Michael's face dimmed instantly, replaced by a defensive chill. "Mom, she's just trying to understand our lives. She's interested." "Is that a crime?" he said, his tone sharper than she had ever heard it. "She feels intimidated by all of this. Can't you see that? She thinks you don't like her." And there it was. The seed of division had been expertly planted. Amelia had already framed Eleanor's potential concerns as dislike, turning a mother's caution into a personal attack. Eleanor saw in that moment that she had no path forward. To push the issue would be to risk pushing her son away, to confirm the very narrative Amelia was weaving. So she retreated. She chose her son's happiness over her own disquiet. She smiled, she hosted dinners, she complimented Amelia on her taste and her devotion to Michael. She silenced the alarm bells ringing in her own head, convincing herself it was the only choice she could make. She welcomed the wolf into her home, and for the sake of peace, she pretended it was a lamb. It was a silence she would soon come to regret, a silence that would cost her nearly everything. The marriage of Michael and Amelia was a lavish affair, a temporary anesthetic for the family's grief. Eleanor had hosted it at the Vance estate, playing the part of the gracious mother of the groom with flawless poise, even as a quiet unease continued to coil in her stomach. She told herself it was just the stress of the wedding, the lingering sadness of Richard not being there to see his son married. For a few months, a fragile peace settled over the family. Amelia was the perfect newlywed, doting on Michael and deferential to Eleanor. And then came the day of the formal reading of the will. It was a somber affair, held in the hushed, mahogany-paneled conference room of Sterling and Croft, the law firm that had managed the Vance family's affairs for half a century. The air was thick with the scent of old leather and finality. Mr. Abernathy, a man whose serious demeanor seemed carved from granite, sat at the head of the long, polished table. He had been Richard's lawyer, his confidant, and his friend. He looked at Eleanor with a deep, knowing respect before he began. Eleanor sat with a quiet composure, a black pearl brooch her only adornment. Michael, seated beside her, looked pale and drawn, the reality of his father's death settling upon him with a fresh weight in this formal setting. And beside Michael sat Amelia. She was a study in supportive grace, dressed in a simple but impeccably tailored gray dress, her hand resting gently on her husband's forearm. She projected an aura of quiet empathy, her expression one of solemn respect for the gravity of the moment. She was, to all outward appearances, the perfect daughter-in-law, there to support her husband in his time of sorrow. Mr. Abernathy cleared his throat and began to read from the thick vellum document. His voice was a low, steady drone, reciting the usual legal preamble. He detailed a few personal bequests: Richard's vintage watch to Michael, his collection of maritime paintings to a local museum. Eleanor listened with a distant sadness, the words washing over her. She knew what was coming. She and Richard had spent countless hours with Mr. Abernathy, crafting this document to be an unbreachable fortress. Then, the lawyer arrived at the heart of the matter: the disposition of the main estate and the governance of the Vance family trust. All remaining assets, Mr. Abernathy read, his voice resonating in the still room, both real and intangible, including all controlling shares in Vance Properties LLC, and the entirety of my personal liquid estate, shall be held in the irrevocable Vance Family Trust. He paused, looking over his spectacles at the small group. Michael nodded slowly. This was expected. Amelia's posture remained unchanged, her expression serene. But Eleanor was not looking at her son. Her gaze was fixed on her new daughter-in-law. Mr. Abernathy continued, and with his next words, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. It was my express and unwavering wish that my beloved wife, Eleanor Vance, be appointed the sole and exclusive trustee of the Vance Family Trust to serve for the duration of her natural life. The room was utterly silent. Eleanor could hear the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. As sole trustee, The lawyer went on, emphasizing each word. She is granted full and discretionary power over the management, investment, and distribution of all assets therein. Amelia's hand, which had been resting so gently on Michael's arm, tightened. It was a small, convulsive movement, almost imperceptible, but Eleanor saw it. Then came the final, sealing clause. My son, Michael Vance, for whom I hold the deepest love and affection, shall receive a generous annual stipend from the Trust's net earnings, the amount of which is to be reviewed and determined annually at the sole discretion of the trustee. The words sole discretion hung in the air like a judge's sentence. For Amelia, it was a death knell to her ambitions. In that moment, as Mr. Abernathy continued to drone on about legal minutiae, Eleanor watched the carefully constructed mask of Amelia's devotion crack. It was not a dramatic shattering, but a subtle, terrifying disintegration. The soft empathy in her eyes vanished, replaced for a single, unguarded second by a flash of cold reptilian fury. Her jaw clenched almost imperceptibly, and the supportive smile on her lips became a thin, bloodless line. She had the look of a gambler who had pushed all her chips into the center of the table, only to see the final card reveal a losing hand. She caught herself quickly, forcing the pleasant mask back into place, but it was too late. Eleanor had seen it. The truth was laid bare in that fleeting expression, more clearly than any legal document could ever state. Amelia had not married a man. She had attempted a corporate merger, and she had just been informed that her voting rights were non-existent. In that quiet, wood-paneled room, all of Eleanor's vague premonitions, all the little red flags she had so diligently ignored, coalesced into a single, horrifying certainty. The intrusive questions, the appraisal of her jewelry, the isolation of her son, it was all part of a long-term acquisition strategy. And she, Eleanor, was the one unforeseen, immovable obstacle in the contract. Michael, lost in his own quiet grief and respect for his father's wishes, noticed nothing. He simply squeezed his wife's hand, grateful for her presence. When Mr. Abernathy finally finished, the meeting concluded with somber handshakes. Michael was quiet on the ride home, contemplative. Amelia, however, was the first to speak, her voice a carefully modulated blend of concern and innocence. "That's a tremendous amount of responsibility for your mother," she murmured, looking at Michael. "Managing all of that, at her age, it must be overwhelming." And there it was. The first stone had been cast. The first seed of doubt planted. It wasn't an accusation. It was a suggestion wrapped in the guise of love and worry. It was the beginning of a narrative, the first chapter in a story of a beloved matriarch becoming a feeble, incompetent burden. Eleanor, sitting in the front seat, stared out the window at the passing landscape, her heart cold and heavy. Richard hadn't just left her his fortune. He had left her a final, silent warning. He had seen the predator at the gates, and in his final act of love, had handed her the keys to the fortress. The war had not yet been declared, but Eleanor knew, with absolute certainty, that the first shots had just been fired. The initial attack was not a frontal assault, but a quiet, insidious siege. Amelia knew that in a community built on reputation and appearances, a direct accusation would seem crass and unbelievable. The whispers of a concerned, loving daughter-in-law, however, were an infinitely more potent weapon. Her campaign began not with malice, but with a beautifully orchestrated performance of sorrow and anxiety. She chose her targets with care, the community's most influential gossips, the women who sat on charity boards, the wives of Richard's former business associates. At luncheons or over coffee at the club, she would sigh, her brow furrowed with a practiced worry. "I don't know what to do about Eleanor," she would begin, her voice a soft, confidential murmur. "I love her dearly, but she's been so forgetful lately. The other day, she insisted we had an appointment that was never made. She got quite upset when I tried to gently correct her. It's starting to happen more and more." She was a master of turning the mundane into the menacing. A simple, misplaced set of keys became evidence of cognitive decline. An offhand, tired comment by Eleanor was twisted into a sign of deep-seated anger. Amelia would collect these tiny, insignificant moments and weave them into a compelling narrative of a brilliant mind beginning to unravel. She would call a friend, her voice trembling slightly. Eleanor was supposed to sign some papers for Michael's new project, and she completely forgot who the architect was. Can you imagine? She adored his work just last year. Michael is worried sick, but he doesn't want to upset her by saying anything. Each story was a delicate brushstroke on a portrait of incompetence, painted with the colors of feigned love and reluctance. The lies became bolder, more audacious, as she gained confidence. She began to rewrite history, subtly tarnishing the one thing Eleanor held most sacred: her marriage to Richard. This part of the campaign was her most vicious and most effective work. She would find a quiet moment with someone like Patricia, her eyes welling with crocodile tears. "It's so hard for Michael," she'd whisper, dabbing at her eye. "He carries so much guilt. He told me that his mother's moods were very difficult for his father at the end. Richard was such a stoic man. He never complained. But Michael saw the toll it took. Of course, you'd never hear that from him. He's fiercely loyal. But I see how it haunts him, seeing her become so volatile again." This was a particularly evil genius. The lie was unfalsifiable, as Richard was no longer there to defend his wife. It conscripted Michael's well-known loyalty into her service, turning his love for his parents into a weapon against his own mother. It planted a dark seed of doubt about a love story that everyone in their circle had once admired as perfect, and it provided a convenient, prepackaged explanation for Eleanor's supposed current-day instability. It wasn't new, it was a return to an old, hidden pattern of behavior. All of this, of course, was the public-facing campaign. At home, she played a different role for a different audience: her husband. With Michael, she was the long-suffering victim, a loving wife being pushed away by a cold and resentful mother-in-law. Her performance was flawless. She would wait for Michael to come home from work, and he would find her sitting quietly, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. "What's wrong, honey?" he would ask, his heart sinking. "Oh, it's nothing, darling," she would say bravely. "It's just, I tried so hard with your mother today. I brought her that soup she likes from the deli, and she barely said 2 words to me. I feel like everything I do is wrong. I just want her to like me." Michael, a man whose entire nature was geared toward fixing things and making people happy, was caught in her web completely. He saw his beautiful, kind wife trying her best, only to be met with what he perceived as his mother's inexplicable coldness. He couldn't see the careful manipulation, the dozens of tiny provocations Amelia would employ to elicit a tired or curt response from Eleanor, which she would then present to Michael as evidence of his mother's cruelty. This led to the conversations that broke Eleanor's heart far more than any gossip ever could. Michael would come to see her, his face a mask of pained concern. "Mom," he would start, his voice gentle. "Can you please just try a little harder with Amelia? She's trying so hard to be part of this family. She feels like you're shutting her out." Eleanor found herself in an impossible position. How could she defend herself? If she said, "Your wife is a manipulative liar who is trying to steal your inheritance," she would sound unhinged, paranoid, confirming every lie Amelia had ever told about her. If she tried to remain silent and dignified, her silence was interpreted as cold guilt. If she tried to calmly explain a financial decision that Amelia had twisted, she sounded defensive and confused. Amelia had created a perfect trap where every move Eleanor made was further proof of her alleged instability. The true agony for Eleanor was not the loss of her reputation, it was the loss of her son. She looked at him, the boy she had raised, the man whose character she thought she knew better than her own, and she saw a stranger. She saw a man so blinded by his wife's performance that he was willing to believe the worst of his own mother. He was not a malicious participant, but an unwitting accomplice, a puppet whose strings were being pulled with devastating skill. And that was the cruelest cut of all. He truly believed he was the peacemaker, the noble son trying to bridge the gap between 2 difficult women. He saw himself as the hero of the story, never realizing he was the primary victim. The pressure mounted, a slow, crushing weight. The campaign was working. Friends called less often. Invitations dwindled. The world she had so carefully built with Richard was shrinking, its walls closing in around her. The whispers followed her everywhere, in the hushed silences when she entered a room, in the pitying glances from people she had known for a lifetime. But the lowest point, the moment the siege reached the very door of her spirit, came on a rainy Sunday afternoon. Michael sat across from her in the den, his hands clasped nervously. "Mom," he said, his eyes pleading with her to understand. "Amelia and we've been talking, and we're just worried about you. We think it might be a good idea for you to talk to someone, a doctor, just to, check on things." The words, spoken with such earnest, misguided love, were the ultimate betrayal. Her own son, at the behest of his wife, was suggesting she was mentally incompetent. He was no longer just defending Amelia, he was actively participating in her strategy. In that moment, Eleanor felt a profound and desolate loneliness. The battle was no longer outside her walls. It was inside her home, and the face of her enemy looked heartbreakingly like the face of her own son. The whispers, once confined to the corners of the country club, had now become a suffocating fog that seeped into every aspect of Eleanor's life. The change was not abrupt or dramatic. It was a gradual icing over of her world. It was in the small, daily cuts that the true depth of her isolation was revealed. The phone, which once rang with a steady rhythm of invitations and friendly chats, now sat silent for days on end. When she did venture out, to the grocery store or the local bookstore, she was met with a new, uniform expression from those she had known for years, a tight, pitying smile, followed by a hasty retreat. Conversations would falter as she approached, resuming in hushed tones only after she had passed. She was becoming a ghost in her own life, a subject of sad, cautionary tales she could not hear but could feel in the shifting atmosphere around her. The vast, empty space around her table in the club dining room became a symbol of her new status, an invisible quarantine line that no one dared to cross. She was no longer Eleanor Vance, matriarch and philanthropist. She was poor Eleanor, the tragic figure at the center of the community's newest, most compelling drama. This slow social starvation was painful, but the true wound, the one that festered and refused to heal, was Michael. After his suggestion that she see a doctor, a chasm had opened between them. He still performed his weekly duty of a Sunday phone call, but the conversations were stilted and sterile, carefully avoiding any topic of substance. They talked about the weather, about his work, about anything and everything except the monstrous lie that was living and breathing between them. Eleanor, feeling the last vestiges of their connection slipping away, decided she had to make one final, desperate attempt to reach the son she knew was still buried somewhere, beneath Amelia's influence. She called him and asked him to come to the house, alone. He arrived with the wary, pained expression of someone walking into a preordained argument. They sat in the den, Richard's portrait bearing silent witness from above the fireplace. Eleanor did not raise her voice. She spoke with a calm, chilling precision, her words stripped of all emotion. "Michael," she began, "I am going to say this to you once. Your wife is systematically and deliberately destroying my life. She has been spreading vicious lies about my mental state and my marriage to your father. She is doing this because she wants control of the family trust, and she believes the only way to get it is to have me declared incompetent. That is the truth." End of 10. She watched his face, praying to see a flicker of doubt, a glimmer of the intelligent, perceptive boy she had raised. Instead, she saw his expression harden, his eyes filling not with anger, but with a deep, profound disappointment in her. "I cannot believe what I'm hearing," he said, his voice low and strained. "Mom, this is it. This is the paranoia Amelia has been so worried about. You've created this elaborate conspiracy theory because you can't accept that I'm happy with her. She loves me. She has tried everything to win you over, and all you've done is push her away with this bitterness." Every word was a dagger. He was reciting a script Amelia had written for him, and he was delivering it with the conviction of an zealot. Eleanor felt the last of her hope drain away. "She is your wife," Eleanor stated, her voice flat. "But I am your mother. You have known me your entire life." Michael stood up, unable to sit still any longer. He paced in front of the fireplace, his back to her. "And that's what makes this so hard. I know you, which means this person, this angry, suspicious person. This isn't you. I don't know what's happened, but I have to stand by my wife. She is my family now. If you are making me choose Mom, then I choose her." He turned to face her, his eyes pleading. "Please, just stop this. For all of us." He left shortly after, and the finality of his choice echoed in the oppressive silence of the house. The bond, stretched thin for months, had finally snapped. The public execution of her reputation came a week later. It happened at the quarterly board meeting of the Vance Foundation for Children, the charity she and Richard had founded 20 years prior. It was her passion project, the living embodiment of her belief in giving back. She walked into the boardroom she had designed, took her seat as chairwoman emeritus, and prepared for a routine meeting. But the agenda was anything but routine. After the initial pleasantries, the new chairman, a young man named Robert, whom she had personally mentored, cleared his throat and avoided her gaze. He began to read from a prepared statement. He spoke of the foundation's need to evolve and embrace a new era of leadership. He used corporate buzzwords like restructuring and dynamic vision. Then, he delivered the killing blow. "And in light of this new direction," he said, his voice strained, "the board has voted to respectfully request that Eleanor step back from her active duties. We believe a period of rest is well-deserved, and we want to thank her for her years of unparalleled service." It was a public firing, wrapped in the silken ribbon of faux deference. It was an ambush. She looked around the table at the faces of people she had considered friends, people who had sat in her home and shared her hospitality. They all refused to meet her eyes, their gazes fixed on the polished surface of the table. She knew Amelia had gotten to them, whispering her poison, convincing them that Eleanor was now a liability, a doddering old woman whose name was becoming a source of embarrassment rather than prestige. In that moment, Eleanor felt nothing. The capacity for shock or pain had been exhausted. There was only a vast, cold emptiness. She did not argue. She did not protest. She simply gathered her leather-bound notebook, stood with an unwavering straightness in her spine, and said in a clear, steady voice, "I see. Thank you, Robert. I wish you all the best." She walked out of the room, her head held high, leaving behind a wake of stunned, guilty silence. That evening, sitting alone in the cavernous quiet of her house, she finally understood the totality of her defeat. She had lost her community, her life's work, her friends, and her son. She had been stripped of everything that defined her, save for the house and the fortune Amelia so desperately craved. She was utterly, completely alone. It was the lowest she had ever been, a desolate landscape of loss. And it was there, in that absolute darkness, that a single cold ember of rage began to glow. When you have nothing left to lose, you are finally free to do whatever it takes to win. For 2 days, Eleanor did not leave the house. She moved through the silent, cavernous rooms like a phantom, the profound emptiness of her new reality pressing in on her from all sides. The pain of her son's betrayal and the public humiliation at the foundation were a physical weight, a crushing pressure in her chest that made it difficult to breathe. She ate little, slept less. She would find herself standing in the middle of the grand foyer or the formal dining room, surrounded by a lifetime of beautiful objects that now seemed like meaningless props on an abandoned stage. Her grief was a desolate, featureless landscape. She had lost everything that mattered, and for a moment, she allowed herself to sink into the abyss. She ended up, as she always did in times of crisis, in Richard's library. The room was the heart of the home, a sanctuary of leather, wood, and the comforting scent of old books. It was a room of intellect, of strategy, of quiet power. She sank into his favorite worn leather armchair, the one that still held the faint imprint of his body, and stared at the large portrait of him hanging above the marble fireplace. He was painted in his prime, a man of 50, his eyes alight with the keen intelligence and unwavering determination that had built an empire from nothing. He looked directly out from the canvas, not smiling, but with an expression of profound confidence, of a man who understood the world and his place in it. For hours, Eleanor just looked at that portrait, her mind a hollow echo chamber of loss. She remembered his favorite sayings, maxims he had lived by. Never make a decision out of fear. Ellie. The best defense is a meticulous offense. Let them underestimate you, it's the most powerful weapon you have. The words drifted through her mind, ghosts of a stronger time. And then, something shifted. It was not a sudden epiphany, but a slow, dawning realization. Her silence, her dignified retreat in the face of Amelia's attacks, was not strength. It was fear. She had been afraid of conflict, afraid of alienating Michael further, afraid of becoming the very monster Amelia was painting her to be. And that fear had allowed a liar to dismantle her husband's legacy and steal her son. She looked into the painted eyes of her husband and understood. Richard Vance had never, not once in his life, backed down from a fight he believed in. He would be appalled to see her like this, a victim in her own home, surrendering the field to a second-rate schemer. Her quiet suffering was not honoring his memory, it was desecrating it. The grief, the hurt, the profound loneliness, it did not vanish. Instead, it began to change, to transmute. Under the immense pressure of her loss, the soft carbon of her sorrow began to crystallize into something impossibly hard, something with sharp, cutting edges. The tears stopped. The tremor in her hands stilled. A cold, clarifying purpose settled over her, chilling and absolute. The war had been brought to her, and she had been losing because she had refused to fight. That ended now. She would not fight Amelia's way, with whispers and lies. She would fight her way, Richard's way, with facts, with evidence, and with overwhelming, undeniable truth. She would treat this not as a family squabble, but as a hostile takeover attempt, and she would crush it. Her mind, which had been fogged with pain, was now operating with the lethal precision of a surgeon. She began to analyze her position. Her opponent, Amelia, was cunning but arrogant. Her greatest weakness was her belief that she had already won. Her primary weapon was deception. Eleanor's own assets were considerable. She had resources, a lifetime of goodwill from a few loyal corners, and most importantly, she had the truth on her side. But the truth was useless without proof. Her first move was not to call Michael or her friends. It was to call the one man she knew held an unwavering loyalty to Richard's memory. Mr. Abernathy, now retired but as sharp as ever. She found his private number and dialed. He answered on the second ring. Abernathy. His voice was a familiar, gravelly baritone. Abernathy, this is Eleanor Vance, she said, her own voice startling her with its steadiness. There was a brief pause on the line. Eleanor, I have been thinking of you. I was distressed to hear about the events at the Foundation. So, the news had traveled. The Foundation is the least of it, she said calmly. I am calling because I need a name. I require the services of a private investigator. The best you know. Not someone who handles tawdry marital disputes. I need someone who specializes in complex financial and personal histories. Someone utterly discreet, technologically adept, and ruthlessly efficient. Abernathy did not ask why. The tone of her voice told him everything he needed to know. He had seen predators circle the wealthy families of Connecticut his entire career, and he recognized the sound of a matriarch preparing for war. I know exactly the man, he said without hesitation. His name is David Chen, former federal prosecutor, specialized in white-collar crime. He left the service to start his own consulting firm. He finds facts that powerful people have spent millions to bury. He is methodical, invisible, and he has no sentiment. He is also ferociously expensive. That will not be a problem, Eleanor said. Thank you, Abernathy. You have been a great friend. I was Richard's friend, the old lawyer corrected gently. Protecting you is the same thing. Be careful, Eleanor. She hung up the phone and, without a moment's hesitation, dialed the number Abernathy had given her. A crisp, professional voice answered. Chen Consulting. I would like to speak with Mr. Chen, Eleanor said, her voice pure ice and steel. My name is Eleanor Vance. There was a brief hold, then a new voice came on the line, calm and measured. This is David Chen. Mr. Chen, Eleanor said, getting straight to the point. I require your services for a highly sensitive internal family matter. I need to schedule a meeting at your earliest convenience. "I could be available tomorrow morning." "What is the nature of the inquiry, Mrs. Vance?" he asked, his voice impassive. Eleanor looked up at Richard's portrait, at the eyes that held no fear, and she laid out the first order of a war she was now determined to win. "The nature of the inquiry," she said, her voice low and steady, "is my daughter-in-law, Amelia Vance. I want to know everything about her, her real name, if it's different, her family, her education, her past relationships, her financial history, every secret she has. Concurrently, I require you to gather definitive, irrefutable proof of a systematic slander campaign she is currently conducting against me." She hung up the phone after setting the meeting. The oppressive silence of the library no longer felt like a tomb. It felt like a war room. The pain in her heart had not gone away, but it now had a purpose. It was the fuel. The quiet, grieving widow was gone. In her place sat the sole trustee of the Vance Family Trust, and she was finally ready to manage her most important asset, the truth. The hunt had begun. David Chen was not what Eleanor had expected. He wasn't a grizzled, trench-coated cliché from an old film. He was a man of medium height and build, dressed in a simple, well-tailored dark suit, whose most remarkable feature was his complete and utter stillness. When he sat in the armchair opposite her in Richard's library, he seemed to absorb the light and sound around him, a small, quiet vortex of observation. He listened to Eleanor's story without interruption, his eyes, sharp and intelligent, never leaving her face. She told him everything, her voice a low, steady monotone, laying out the facts of Amelia's campaign with the dispassionate clarity she had perfected. She presented her problem not as a heartbroken mother, but as the CEO of a corporation facing a significant internal threat. When she was finished, Chen nodded slowly, a single, decisive movement. "I understand," he said, his voice as calm and measured as his demeanor. "The operation will have two primary objectives, running in parallel. Objective Alpha, a full-spectrum background investigation into the subject, Amelia Vance. Objective Bravo, the gathering of direct evidence related to the current defamation campaign. You will receive encrypted reports from me on a weekly basis. Nothing will be traceable to you." And so, the quiet war began. David Chen and his team moved like ghosts through the ether of public records and digital footprints. The first report arrived a week later in Eleanor's private email, a sterile, bullet-pointed document that was more devastating than any emotional accusation. The first revelation was the name. Amelia Vance, née Thorne, was, in fact, born Jennifer Paskins from a small, forgotten town in rural Ohio. The elegant, vaguely European backstory she had cultivated, involving boarding schools in Switzerland and a tragic orphan narrative, was a complete fabrication. Chen had located her family. Her parents were alive, as was a resentful older brother. Chen's field operative had conducted a discreet interview. "Jenny," the brother had said, according to the transcript. "Yeah, we haven't seen her in 15 years. She always thought she was too good for us. She read fancy magazines and practiced talking like the people on TV. Last we saw her, she was heading for Cleveland with the life savings of some poor schmuck who thought he was going to marry her." Subsequent reports filled in the blanks. Chen's team uncovered a trail of Janice and Amelia's across the Midwest, and then the East Coast. There was a string of relationships with affluent, often recently widowed or divorced men. Each followed a similar pattern, a whirlwind romance, a period of apparent devotion, followed by a sudden, often dramatic departure, always preceded by the acquisition of significant gifts, cars, jewelry, and large cash transfers. She was a professional, a predator with a decade of experience in her chosen field. Michael wasn't the first. He was simply the biggest prize she had ever hunted. While Chen was excavating the past, Eleanor became an active agent in documenting the present. This was Chen's idea. "Your presence is your greatest asset, Mrs. Vance," he had told her. "You have access no operative of mine ever could. You simply need the right tools." A day later, a courier delivered a small, discreet package. Inside were several items that looked utterly ordinary. A sleek, expensive-looking fountain pen, a small digital clock for her bedside table, a phone charger. They were, of course, all state-of-the-art recording devices. Chen gave her a lesson over a secure video call, his instructions clear and concise. He showed her how to activate the devices, how to download the audio files, how to position them for optimal clarity. Eleanor, a woman who had once needed Michael's help to set up a new laptop, became a surprisingly adept student of espionage. The grief that had clouded her mind for months was replaced by a laser-like focus. Learning the tradecraft gave her a sense of control, a feeling of empowerment she hadn't had in years. She began to carry the pen everywhere. The first clear recording she captured was a moment of pure, chilling serendipity. She had been in the sunroom, resting on the chaise lounge, her eyes closed. Amelia, thinking her asleep, had taken a phone call. Eleanor's heart hammered in her chest as she heard Amelia's bright, public voice shift into a tone of smug, venomous contempt. "You wouldn't believe how easy it is, Trish," Amelia said, her voice a triumphant whisper. "He's completely wrapped around my finger. He actually suggested his own mother see a shrink. I'm telling you, the old bat will be signing over power of attorney by the end of the year, and she won't even know what she's doing." The recording was crystal clear, a perfect, damning piece of evidence. That file, saved and encrypted, became the first weapon in her growing arsenal. Eleanor also found an unexpected but crucial ally in her own home. Maria, their housekeeper of 30 years, had been with the family since Michael was a boy. She loved Eleanor and had revered Richard. Her loyalty was absolute, and she had watched Amelia's arrival with a silent, simmering disapproval. One evening, as Eleanor was reviewing one of Chen's reports in the library, Maria entered with a tray of tea. Her face was troubled. "Mrs. Vance," she began hesitantly, "I do not wish to speak out of turn, but that woman, she is not good." Maria went on to recount things she had observed. Amelia going through the drawers in Richard's desk when she thought no one was home, the mocking way she would imitate Eleanor's walk behind her back, the cruel, dismissive tone she used with the gardening staff. She had overheard Amelia on the phone, laughing about how she was managing the old lady's decline. Maria agreed to provide a signed, sworn statement of everything she had seen and heard. It was another vital piece of the puzzle, a testament to Amelia's character from an unimpeachable source. The evidence mounted, piece by meticulous piece. Chen's forensic accountants found email inquiries Amelia had sent from a private account to estate lawyers in New York, asking hypothetical questions about how one might legally challenge a trustee's competence. They found online shopping receipts for luxury goods that far exceeded the generous allowance Michael gave her, suggesting she had other sources of income she was not disclosing. Eleanor's own devices captured more conversations. Amelia boasting to her mother, the one she claimed was deceased, about her brilliant strategy. Amelia complaining to Michael that his mother was hiding assets. The library, once a place of quiet reflection, had become Eleanor's command center. Every evening, she would sit at Richard's large oak desk, the soft glow of the lamp illuminating the files spread before her. There were Chen's reports, neatly bound, transcripts of Maria's testimony, digital folders containing hours of audio evidence, financial charts, a complete, unassailable timeline of Amelia's lies. She was no longer a victim, buffeted by the whims of a malicious actor. She was a general on the eve of battle, reviewing her maps and her troop strength. The arsenal was locked and loaded. The pain of her son's betrayal had not lessened, but it now coexisted with a cold, clear sense of purpose. She had the truth, in all its ugly, documented detail. The only question that remained was choosing the right time and the right place to deploy it for maximum, devastating effect. With her arsenal of truth assembled and catalogued, Eleanor understood a crucial principle of warfare, one her husband Richard had often applied in his business dealings. You do not launch an attack when your enemy is on high alert. You wait. You lull them into a state of complacent victory. You let them believe their own propaganda, and you draw them onto a field of battle of your own choosing. Her next move, therefore, would not be an attack at all. It would be a surrender, a beautifully orchestrated, meticulously performed, and utterly false surrender. The great, silent war of attrition was over. The new war, a war of deception, was about to begin. She started by becoming the woman Amelia had invented. The transformation was subtle at first, a slow, deliberate crumbling of her famously sharp intellect. During Michael and Amelia's next visit, she forgot that they had spoken on the phone just the day before. She asked Amelia about a trip she had supposedly taken, only to be gently corrected that the trip was weeks away. She would trail off mid-sentence, a look of faint confusion clouding her features, before shaking her head and saying, "Oh, forgive me, I've lost my train of thought." It seems to happen so often these days. Each of these small, calculated lapses was a piece of bait, eagerly swallowed by Amelia. Eleanor could see the triumphant glint in her daughter-in-law's eyes, the small, satisfied smile she tried to hide as she exchanged a knowing look with Michael. Amelia would then report these incidents back to her network of gossips, her voice heavy with sorrow. "It's getting worse," she'd say over the phone, loud enough for Maria, the housekeeper, to overhear. "She's slipping away right in front of us. It's just heartbreaking." Next, Eleanor set the Trojan horse. She knew from Maria that Amelia had a habit of snooping in the library when she thought no one was looking. So, Eleanor began to leave carefully selected documents on Richard's desk. She left a quarterly investment statement from a high-risk tech fund showing a significant, though temporary, downturn. The statement was 3 months out of date, and she had since sold the stock for a substantial profit, but Amelia wouldn't know that. She left meeting notes with scrawled, seemingly confused questions in the margins. She even left a mock-up of a new will, a document she had her old lawyer draft, as a prop that contained several contradictory and nonsensical clauses, the perfect picture of a deteriorating mind. These documents were the poison apples, designed to feed Amelia's greed and confirm her belief that the Vance fortune was being incompetently managed by a woman on the verge of senility. The trap was being baited, piece by irresistible piece. The masterstroke of her performance came when Michael, buoyed by his wife's reports of Eleanor's decline, approached her with a new proposition. He suggested a formal mediation session with a family therapist Amelia had found. "It's not about blame, Mom," he said, his voice earnest and pleading. "It's about finding a way for us all to move forward, to heal." The old Eleanor would have refused, insulted by the very suggestion. But the new Eleanor, the general in the midst of a feigned retreat, saw the opportunity immediately. She looked at her son, her eyes wide with a manufactured vulnerability. "Oh, Michael," she said, her voice trembling slightly. I think that might be a very good idea. I haven't been myself. I know I've been difficult." The look of relieved shock on Michael's face was her first taste of victory. They met a week later in a sterile beige office that smelled of air freshener and repressed emotions. The therapist was a kind-looking woman whom Amelia had clearly already primed with her version of events. Amelia herself was a portrait of patient suffering, while Michael played the part of the dutiful son, desperate for a resolution. But it was Eleanor who commanded the stage. She was dressed in a simple gray cashmere sweater, looking smaller and more fragile than they had ever seen her. She slumped in her chair, her hands clutching a damp tissue. For an hour, she let Amelia and Michael talk, a carefully orchestrated duet of concern and gentle accusation. They spoke of her forgetfulness, her uncharacteristic spending, her social withdrawal. Eleanor simply listened, nodding occasionally, her expression one of dawning, painful realization. When it was her turn to speak, she did not defend herself. She crumbled. Tears streamed down her face as she looked at her son. "I'm so sorry, Michael," she wept, her voice choked with emotion. "I know I haven't been fair to Amelia. Since your father passed, everything is just so overwhelming. The house, the trust, it's all too much." She then turned her gaze to Amelia, a look of complete and utter capitulation in her eyes. "You have been so kind, my dear, so patient with an old woman. You are a wonderful wife to my son. I see that now. You were right all along. I think I do need help." The performance was flawless. She had given them exactly what they wanted: a confession, an admission of defeat, a complete validation of their entire narrative. On the car ride home, Michael was giddy with relief. He held Amelia's hand, telling her how brilliant she was, how this was the breakthrough they had been praying for. Amelia, for her part, was basking in the glow of absolute triumph. She just needed to get there on her own time, darling, she said, her voice smooth as silk. Now we can finally start to get things in order. We can help her manage the estate properly. They were utterly convinced the war was over. They had won. They were no longer adversaries to be wary of, but victorious saviors, preparing to take control of their prize. Their guard was not just down, it was entirely dismantled. That night, Eleanor sat alone in the library. The frail, weeping woman from the therapist's office had vanished. In her place was a figure of cold, unyielding resolve. Her eyes were dry, her expression impassive. She was not celebrating. This was merely a necessary, if distasteful, step in a much larger plan. She opened her leather-bound planner, its pages filled with her neat, elegant script. With a steady hand, she turned to a date 3 weeks in the future and drew a single, definitive circle around it. It was the date of the annual Vance Foundation Charity Gala. The perfect venue, the perfect audience, the perfect stage for a final act. The retreat was over. The enemy, drunk on a victory she had served to them on a silver platter, was now marching gleefully and blindly into the trap. Eleanor closed the book. The silence of the house was no longer lonely. It was expectant. It was the deep, patient silence of a predator, waiting for the precise moment to strike. Every army needs a battlefield, a piece of ground so perfectly suited to its strategy that victory becomes an inevitability. For Eleanor, that battlefield had a name: the annual Vance Foundation Charity Gala. It was the glittering apex of the community's social calendar, an event she and Richard had created 2 decades ago. It was held each year in the grand ballroom of the city's most historic hotel, a cavern of crystal chandeliers and gilded columns. This was the stage where reputations were cemented, where power was displayed with the clinking of champagne glasses and the rustle of silk. It was the very arena where Amelia had so successfully prosecuted her war of whispers. It was, therefore, the only place where justice could be properly seen to be done. In the weeks following her theatrical surrender at the therapist's office, Eleanor underwent another, more public transformation. She began to emerge from her self-imposed exile, but as a changed woman. She was softer, more deferential. When the Foundation's planning committee approached her about the upcoming gala, they expected her to demur as she had for the past 2 years. Instead, to their surprise, she announced that she wanted to take the lead in its planning one last time. I feel more like myself again, she explained to a relieved Michael and a triumphant Amelia over dinner. The therapy has helped me see things more clearly. I want this year's gala to be a true celebration of Richard's legacy, a final, personal tribute, before I step back from things. Amelia could barely contain her glee. It was perfect. A public farewell, a passing of the torch, all orchestrated by the outgoing matriarch herself. It lent the entire transition an air of grace and legitimacy. Of course, Mother Vance, Amelia said, her voice dripping with syrupy sweetness. We'll help you with everything. It will be your masterpiece. Eleanor smiled serenely. Thank you, my dear, but I want to handle the details myself. It's important for my own sense of closure. This, too, was interpreted as a positive sign, a fragile woman taking a final, therapeutic victory lap. They left her to it, never once suspecting that the party she was planning was not a tribute, but a tribunal. The first step was to ensure the attendance of every key player. The invitations, printed on heavy, cream-colored cardstock, were sent out with a special, intriguing addendum. At the bottom, in elegant script, it read, "This year's gala will feature a special address by our founder, Eleanor Vance, who will be making a significant announcement regarding the future leadership and direction of the Vance Foundation." The hook was set. The entire community was buzzing. The gossip network, which had feasted on Eleanor's supposed decline for months, was now salivating at the prospect of her public abdication. Everyone who had shunned her, pitied her, or judged her would be there, eager for the final, dramatic chapter. For Amelia and Michael, this was the public coronation they had dreamed of. This was the moment their victory would be formalized in front of all their peers. They envisioned a tearful, grateful speech from Eleanor, officially anointing them as the new, vibrant leaders of the Vance legacy. While Amelia spent her days shopping for the perfect inauguration gown, Eleanor spent her nights in the library, which had been converted into a meticulously organized war room. Her work was a masterpiece of clandestine planning. She informed the gala committee that she was hiring an outside audiovisual company. Specialists she claimed were renowned for creating moving, high-definition tribute videos. The company, of course, was a discreet firm of ex-federal forensic technicians recommended by David Chen. They were not party planners. They were experts in secure data presentation and high-fidelity audio playback, more accustomed to boardrooms and courtrooms than ballrooms. They worked with Eleanor late into the night, their unmarked vans arriving long after the rest of her staff had gone home. Together, they crafted the centerpiece of the evening. It was not a slideshow of smiling faces from past events. It was a carefully edited, narratively structured presentation of the truth. David Chen sat with her, helping her storyboard the reveal like a film director. They chose the most damning audio clips. Amelia's smug, triumphant voice boasting about manipulating Michael, her contemptuous dismissal of Richard as a fool, her cruel mockery of Eleanor's feigned confusion. They juxtaposed this audio with carefully selected images. A loving photo of Eleanor and Richard on their wedding day, a picture of Michael as a happy child on his father's shoulders. They scanned and digitized the documents Chen had uncovered. The proof of Amelia's real identity, the statements from her estranged family, the reports detailing her pattern of defrauding older men. They created simple, elegant slides that showed the timeline of her lies and the email inquiries she had made about challenging the trust. The final product was a cold, clear, and utterly devastating narrative of a long con. While this digital weapon was being forged, Eleanor managed the more traditional aspects of the event with the same strategic precision. The seating chart was a work of art. Michael and Amelia were given the seats of honor, directly in the center of the head table, positioned perfectly beneath the two largest video screens. Carol and Patricia, the women whose whispers had first alerted Eleanor to the betrayal, were placed at a table directly in front of the stage. The board members who had ousted her from her own foundation were seated to the left, with a clear, unobstructed view. It was a carefully arranged gallery of judges and jurors. In the final days before the gala, the atmosphere in the Vance home was thick with dramatic irony. Amelia was radiant, preening for her moment of triumph. She treated Eleanor with a cloying, condescending kindness, the way one might treat a retiring servant. Michael was relieved and happy, believing he had successfully navigated a difficult family crisis and healed a painful rift. He was proud of his mother for her bravery and proud of his wife for her patience. And Eleanor, at the center of it all, was an oasis of calm. She was serene, gracious, and just the right amount of wistful. She played the part of the departing queen to perfection, moving through the final preparations with a quiet dignity that everyone mistook for acceptance. The day of the gala arrived, a crisp, clear autumn evening. As Eleanor stood before the full-length mirror in her bedroom, she saw not the frail, defeated woman she had been pretending to be, but a figure of immense, unyielding strength. She was not wearing the muted gray of a widow in mourning. She had chosen a gown of deep sapphire blue, a color that radiated power and authority. The cut was simple, elegant, and severe. Around her neck, she wore the sapphire necklace Richard had given her, the very one Amelia had appraised with such cold, greedy eyes months before. It felt like armor. The audience was assembling. Her enemies were taking their seats of honor. The weapons were in place, the technicians ready. She took one last, steadying breath, her reflection in the mirror, showing a woman who had been to the abyss and returned. The performance was over. The final act was about to begin. The grand ballroom of the St. Regis Hotel was a universe of manufactured perfection. A symphony of clinking crystal, muted laughter, and the soft strains of a string quartet filled the air, mingling with the murmur of expensive perfume and quiet power. Hundreds of the state's most influential figures, dressed in their finest silks and tuxedos, moved through the golden light, their faces aglow with the self-satisfaction of the wealthy at play. At the head table, bathed in the warm glow of the main centerpiece, Amelia Vance was holding court. She was incandescent in a gown of emerald green, a triumphant queen surveying her newly conquered kingdom. She laughed, her head tilted back, accepting the fawning compliments of those who orbited her. Michael sat beside her, his face a portrait of pure, unadulterated pride. He looked at his wife, then at the assembled crowd, his heart swelling with a profound sense of peace. His family, after a period of turmoil, was finally whole. He looked for his mother, seated at the other end of the long table, and gave her a warm, grateful smile. She looked serene, if a little distant, in a regal sapphire gown. Everything was finally as it should be. When the time came for the speeches, the room quieted. The Foundation's chairman gave a brief, laudatory introduction, and then all eyes turned to Eleanor as she made her way to the podium. The applause was polite, sustained, tinged with the gentle condescension one affords a beloved figurehead, gracefully making her exit. Her steps were not the shuffling gait of the frail woman they had been led to expect. She moved with a deliberate, unnerving poise, her back ramrod straight. As she adjusted the microphone, a hush fell over the room. She began her speech, her voice as smooth and warm as it had always been. She thanked the donors, the volunteers, the board. She spoke movingly of Richard, of his vision when they first started the foundation. She looked towards her son. "I am so proud of the man my son, Michael, has become," she said, her voice filled with a genuine maternal warmth that made him beam. "And I am so grateful for the energy and dedication his wife, Amelia, has brought to our family." Amelia inclined her head, accepting the tribute with a modest, beatific smile. The audience was lulled, settled in for a gentle, nostalgic farewell. Eleanor let the silence hang for a beat. Then her posture shifted. Her grip on the lectern tightened, and when she spoke again, her voice had lost all of its warmth. It was replaced by something cold, clear, and sharp, as surgical steel. "But legacies are not just about buildings and donations," she said, the sudden change in tone silencing the last whispers in the room. "They are built on a foundation of truth. And tonight, before we look to the future, we must first have a reckoning with the truth of the present." A nervous murmur rippled through the crowd. Michael's smile faltered. Amelia's expression tightened. On the two enormous screens flanking the stage, the logo of the Vance Foundation dissolved, replaced by a simple, stark audio waveform, pulsing silently like a heartbeat. "For the past year," Eleanor continued, her voice now commanding the attention of every person in the room, "there has been a story circulating about me. A story of a woman in her dotage, a mind in decline, a widow who has become a burden. I think it's time we all heard the origins of that story, from the author herself." And then she nodded to the tech booth. Amelia's voice, amplified by the state-of-the-art sound system, filled the cavernous ballroom. It was not the sweet, concerned voice everyone knew. This voice was sharp, arrogant, and dripping with contempt. "The old bat will be signing over power of attorney by the end of the year, and she won't even know what she's doing," the voice sneered. A collective gasp swept through the room. It was an audible, physical shockwave. Hundreds of heads swiveled in unison, staring at the head table where Amelia sat, frozen, her face the color of chalk. Michael looked as if he had been physically struck, his eyes wide with confusion and horror. But Eleanor did not pause. "That was my daughter-in-law, speaking to a friend on the phone, believing I was asleep," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. But the deception began long before that. It began with an identity. The screen changed. A beautiful, professional headshot of Amelia Thorne appeared on the left. On the right, a grainy, decade-old DMV photo of a much younger woman with hard eyes and cheap highlights appeared. Beneath it, the name, Jennifer Paskins. "This is Jennifer Paskins of Dayton, Ohio," Eleanor narrated, as if presenting a museum exhibit. "A woman with a documented history of targeting and defrauding affluent men. A woman whose family, whom she claimed were tragically deceased, are in fact alive and well, and who provided a sworn statement detailing their daughter's long history of manipulation and theft." The screen filled with a timeline, a simple, brutal list of names, dates, and cities, a roadmap of a predator's career. The angry whispers in the room were growing louder now, a furious, buzzing tide of indignation. Amelia was shaking her head, a strangled "no" escaping her lips, but her voice was lost in the vast, accusing silence. Michael stared at the screen, then at his wife, his face a mask of utter devastation, the world he had built with her disintegrating before his eyes. The motive, of course, was never love. Eleanor continued relentlessly. It was money. A new slide appeared, showing copies of emails Amelia had sent to estate lawyers, asking pointed questions about challenging a trustee's authority. The goal was simple: to gain control of the Vance family trust by having me declared mentally incompetent. She paused, letting the weight of the accusation settle. She looked directly at the tables where the foundation's board members sat, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning, sickening guilt. A story many of you were all too willing to believe. Finally, she delivered the coup de grace. But perhaps the most profound betrayal was not against me, but against the man whose name is on this very foundation. The screen flickered to life with grainy, black and white security footage from the Vance library. It showed Amelia, alone in the room, looking up at Richard's portrait. She raised her glass in a mock toast, a cruel smirk on her face. Her voice, captured by one of Eleanor's hidden devices, was thin but clear. "Here's to you, Richard," she sneered. The brilliant, powerful man who was foolish enough to leave his checkbook in the hands of his wife. That was it. The final, unforgivable desecration. The room exploded. It was not shouting, but a roar of disgust. Several people stood up, turning their backs on the head table. Amelia finally broke. "It's a lie. She's a crazy old woman. She faked it all," she shrieked, her voice shrill with panic. But no one was listening. Michael, his face ashen and broken, finally looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw not love or support, but the horrifying dawn of understanding. Eleanor's voice cut through the chaos one last time. "My husband's legacy is not for sale," she said, her voice ringing with the authority of absolute truth. "And my honor is not for you to destroy." She looked at the wreckage of the head table, at the public ruin of the woman who had tried to ruin her, and at the shattered remains of her son's happiness. She felt no triumph, only the cold, grim satisfaction of a battle won at a terrible cost. She turned, without another word, and walked off the stage, leaving the symphony of chaos and judgment to play out behind her. The reckoning was complete. The immediate aftermath in the grand ballroom was not one of loud, theatrical chaos, but of a quiet, brutal social execution. Amelia and Michael Vance did not flee. They were expelled by a silent, collective judgment. As they made their excruciatingly public exit from the head table, the sea of elegantly dressed guests parted before them. Not with respect, but with the revulsion one shows to the carriers of a deadly plague. No one spoke to them, no one met their eyes. They were simply erased, rendered invisible by the sheer force of 100 unforgiving stares. Their marriage, a structure built on a foundation of lies and ambition, crumbled into dust before they even reached the hotel lobby. Within a week, Amelia was gone. True to her predatory nature, she knew when a hunt had failed. She cut her losses, packed what she could, and vanished back into the anonymity from which she had emerged, likely already scouting for a new identity and a new, less formidable target. She left behind only a trail of scorched earth and the broken man she had used as her key. A week later, Michael came to the house. He was a ghost of the proud man who had sat beaming at the gala. He was diminished, hollowed out by the public shame and the private, agonizing realization of his own folly. He stood before Eleanor in the cavernous silence of the library, his face gaunt and tear-streaked, and he begged for her forgiveness. He wept, apologizing for his weakness, for his blindness, for the terrible pain he had allowed his wife to inflict upon his own mother. Eleanor listened, her face impassive. The rage had burned out, leaving behind only the cold, hard ash of consequence. She did not rush to comfort him. The wound he had carved into their relationship was too deep for a simple bandage of maternal love. "Forgiveness, Michael," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "is not a light switch I can simply flip for you. It is not a gift I can give to make you feel better. Trust is a house that takes a lifetime to build. You let a stranger burn ours to the ground. If you want forgiveness, you must rebuild that house, brick by painful brick, knowing all the while that I may never be able to live inside it with you again." Their relationship was not over, but it was forever changed, transformed from a bond of implicit trust into a fragile, uncertain negotiation of a shared, tragic history. Eleanor believed the war was over, the casualties counted, the painful process of rebuilding begun. But there was one final devastating secret yet to be revealed. A month after the gala, a slim final invoice arrived from David Chen. Tucked inside was a small USB drive and a single, typed transcript with a brief, handwritten note. Mrs. Vance, my analysts recovered this from a corrupted audio file found on the subject's cloud backup. I felt you deserved the complete picture. DC. She assumed it was merely a loose end, another piece of the evidence she already possessed. Alone in her library that night, she plugged the drive into her laptop and read the transcript. The conversation was dated from over a year ago, shortly after the reading of the will. It was between Michael and Amelia. But this time, the voice of the puppet was the voice of the puppeteer. She'll never just hand it over, Michael's voice said on the recording, the words transcribed in cold, black ink. She's too sentimental about Dad's wishes. The only way she'll ever let go is if everyone believes she has to, if they believe she's not capable anymore. There was a pause. Then Amelia's voice, intrigued. What are you suggesting? I'm not suggesting anything, Michael replied quickly, his voice betraying his weakness. I'm just saying, people already think she's a fragile old woman. It wouldn't take much to convince them that her mind is starting to go. We would just be helping her, taking the burden off her shoulders. Eleanor read the words, and then she read them again. The screen blurred, and for the first time, not during the months of isolation, not during the public humiliation, not even during the heat of her triumphant revenge, Eleanor Vance broke down and wept. Her sobs were the silent, soul-shattering cries of ultimate loss. The betrayal of Amelia, the con artist, was a simple wound from an enemy. This was a poisoning from within. Her son was not merely a fool blinded by love. He had been a willing, if cowardly, co-conspirator. The idea, the very seed of the entire monstrous campaign, had been his. Amelia was simply the one ruthless enough to execute the strategy he was too weak to carry out himself. She had won the battle for her fortune and her name, but she had, in that moment, truly and irrevocably lost her son. In the years that followed, Eleanor Vance became a legend in her community, a woman spoken of with a mixture of profound respect and a healthy dose of fear. She ran the Vance Foundation with a new, sharp-edged wisdom, her philanthropy now tempered by a deep understanding of the darkness that can hide behind a smiling face. She was gracious, she was kind, but she was never again naive. Her relationship with Michael remained a quiet, sorrowful landscape, a place of shared holidays and polite conversation, forever haunted by the truth only she knew. So, let the story of Eleanor Vance be a lesson. In the quiet dramas of family, of love and of greed, do not ever mistake silence for surrender. Never underestimate the stillness of a person who has endured too much. For when they finally choose to speak, their voice will not be a plea for mercy, but the sound of a final judgment being rendered and a sentence being carried out. Join us again next time for another story from a home where the portraits on the walls hide the most unforgivable of sins.